Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Justin Blake, Executive Director of the Edelman Trust Institute. Today I'm joined by Magdalena Skipper, the Editor-in-Chief of Nature, one of the world's most read academic journals. Magdalena is a geneticist by training and has decades of experience in science, editorial, and publishing. Welcome to Trust Makers.
Pleasure to be here.
So as I mentioned in your introduction, you're the editor of Nature. Talk a little bit about the audience that Nature appeals to and your article selection process.
So Nature is in many ways unlike most scientific journals. The fundamental difference being that in what we publish, we reflect the dual mission, which we started our life with back in 1869. And that is, we publish original research findings, but that we also were launched and charged with placing them in a wider context in which they were made. And so there are two parts to Nature. There is the part which publishes original research. So that's the work that researchers themselves do, and that's peer reviewed, evaluated by our editorial team, and then published. And then there is the magazine part. And that's the part which contains science journalism, opinion, and commentary. And that's the part which places that original research in a wider context. And then, of course, how we select what we publish is intimately linked with the format. I already alluded to the fact that original research is peer reviewed, so by other scientists, experts in the discipline. But very crucially, before we get to this step, it is scientific editors on my team who are experts in those disciplines, who have themselves researched in a given area, who will evaluate that submission against our editorial bar. And we're interested in research which is particularly influential, particularly impactful, of relevance to more than just its own discipline. And sometimes we're interested in research which is surprising and delightful. We really want to have that influence. In your question, by the way, you described Nature as an academic journal. I prefer to think of us as a research journal. And that's to reflect the fact that today research really unfolds in academia, but also in non-academic, publicly funded setting, but also, of course, in the private sector. I think it's worth remembering that as well.
Yeah, you've spoken a lot about how scientists are not just sitting in a lab, they're interacting and partnered with other institutions. Can you expound on that a bit?
Absolutely. Long gone are the days when we thought of researchers sitting in the lab alone in a so-called ivory tower, detached from really the environment in which the research unfolds, and indeed detached from those who support the research financially and in other ways. And it's good that we're seeing that transition for a number of reasons. One of them, most notably, is, of course, research conducted through consultation in a context is better research, research that addresses questions more fully, asks more pertinent questions, etc., etc. And of course, extending your question further, we can consider that partnerships in research are really of essence today, arguably more than ever before. You know, when you look at the history of science and research endeavor, I sometimes map it onto our own history, onto Nature's history. As I mentioned, the journal was launched back in 1869, and it's been a while. We've been around. Science itself, research has changed quite a bit, and of course, so have we. And if you look at the authors in our pages, those were individuals back then who engaged in very multidisciplinary scholarship in a very different way from what it is done today. The middle of the last century, of the 20th century, was really very much focused on zooming into individual disciplines which one could argue could have been done in isolation in a single lab by a very small group of people. Today, research has become much more interdisciplinary, much more cross-sectorial. So, and the questions that researchers grapple with are much more complex. So there is really no option to just stay locked up in a lab on your own.
Since 1869, Nature has been sharing credible information. One of the things that the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer Special Report Trust in Health found is that people feel that information is as important to them feeling good about their own health as cost or access is. At the same time, our respondents noted the dearth of quality health information that they're able to find. Why do you expect quality information is so important as it relates to how people think about their own health outcomes?
Well, at the fundamental level, access to information is, of course, of fundamental importance. And the reason why it's of importance is because it's empowering. And especially when you think in the context of your own health, who doesn't want to be empowered when it comes to their own health? Information allows you to make choices for you, for your dependents. And in this context, access to information becomes really important. And of course, critically, access to trustworthy, verifiable, and verified information is very important. This empowerment, this ability to make decisions and make choices needs to be considered in turn in a context of having that provision to make choice, having access to different possible healthcare options and health support. And of course, this access being affordable. And in this context, we have to remember, of course, that that access and affordability are incredibly unequally distributed across societies and geographies. But information is incredibly empowering. But information can, of course, be damaging when it is misinformation, when it's not adequately verifiable, which in turn makes it so important that individuals know where information comes from, they can trust the source, they can always ask the question, why is that conclusion presented to me and on what basis? So there are two aspects here, the transparency of that information, but also that confidence of individuals to ask the question, why am I presented with this information and can I really trust it?
To your point about misinformation, 41% of our respondents said they regretted a health decision they made based on misinformation. What do you see the role of Nature and maybe other similar outlets to stem the tide of misinformation or to correct misinformation?
I think our role is absolutely critical. And here I'd like to go back to this dual nature of nature, and that is, of course, providing the original facts in this original research format is crucial. But when we're talking about population at large, it's provision of that context, that explanation, providing of the caveats in an unbiased way, which is free of influence, be it commercial or political or ideological, is absolutely essential. And so, to give you an example, I have a team of reporters and news editors who are not only trained as journalists, but also trained as scientists that have science background. Unfortunately, we're seeing across other media decreasing focus and financial support of fully trained science journalists. And I think that's a mistake. All of us, whole societies, are paying for it because, of course, of extremely lively and energetic competition from other sources. They're just producing at very rapid rates misinformation that then cannot be combated appropriately. That's where we at Nature absolutely play a crucial role.
In fact, we found that only 43% of people trust the media to report accurate information about healthcare, which is a significant drop in the last few years, which is particularly troubling considering what's happened in those last few years was a pandemic, why do you think there's been such a steep drop?
I think it's a very interesting question. The COVID pandemic was a very specific time. It was an incredible period of time to live through as an individual, of course, but also as somebody who leads a scientific journal, a scientific publication. We saw, all of us, saw a great deal of attempt to influence how scientific facts, as they were unfolding around the time of the pandemic. And just to remind you, something that we, of course, all remember, information was unfolding effectively in real time for the first time ever. Researchers, healthcare practitioners were dealing very clearly with a new pathogen, with a new disease. We were learning as facts were unfolding. Aspects that are normally part and parcel of research, including health research, such as, for example, trial and error, trying to implement solutions that we know worked in the past in the context of other public health emergencies, but we have no knowledge whether it will work here or not. They are part and parcel of normal dealing with a new disease. And yet, in the course of the pandemic, they were often portrayed as mistakes or lack of information or lack of certainty, which were seeding further lack of trust and seeding further confusion. A lot of damage was done in this way. I think in retrospect, we can look back, analyze, think from the perspective of how research actually unfolds, as I say, including public health. And we need to, from perspective of time, we can look back and say, nothing actually went wrong with the way we applied our methodology. We simply didn't know. And that's indeed how science unfolds. We move forward, we analyze, we observe, we take stock. If we need to move back, we do, we take another avenue. I think historically, we have collectively lacked sufficient insight. We didn't share that insight with the general public of how public health unfolds, how research unfolds. That could have contributed to the figures that we observe.
It sounds like almost the importance of articulating how science works and perhaps sometimes sounding less certain and explaining the process more. As part of your answer, you also mentioned that there were forces that were exerting influence. And I just wanted to make sure that I was inferring correctly. Is that the perception of the politicization of scientists and government and politics exerting influence on the medical community?
That is certainly a large component to it. And there is a lot said and written about politicization of science or research more broadly these days. When considering this, I think it's absolutely essential to realize and stress that this is not a new phenomenon. Probably the oldest and the best known example is that of Galileo, who, of course, was forced by the Catholic Church to recant his support of the Copernican view of the solar system. Probably the best known scientific project of the 20th century was the Manhattan Project, which, of course, we were all reminded of with the recent film Oppenheimer. And that was a government run operation. It was a government run scientific project. Another example, one of my favorite, because as you said, I'm a geneticist, is actually more or less contemporary to the Manhattan Project. And that's the example of the Soviet agronomist Lysenko, who discounted the Mendelian inheritance of characteristics and developed this whole pseudoscientific theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And that homegrown, if you like, pseudoscientific theory was very aggressively backed by the Stalinist government. And of course, application of that particular pseudoscientific breeding programs in Soviet Union and China subsequently led to extensive famines in both countries. So these are well described historic examples of how, to a great detriment, political or ideological views influence or have influenced science. And indeed, Our contemporary examples, the two best known contemporary examples, are that of COVID pandemic and climate change, of course.
That's really helpful historical context. As we think about this particular moment in time, my sense is we're seeing scientists in the crosshairs of the headlines right now. There are plagiarism scandals happening. There are scandals around people being charged with manipulating their research. Can you give a sense of the impact that those headlines and these constant news cycles around this idea of scientific misconduct, how is that impacting the scientific community?
I think it's a really important question because, of course, they have an impact on the scientific community. They have an impact on us all, and they have to be taken in a context. There are a couple of things that come into play here. One is the fact that while science and scientific process, scientific method is well described and well defined, there is no system which is infallible. And of course, scientists are human beings, which sometimes, unfortunately, we forget. At the same time, science has become a very successful career path, a very attractive way of dedicating one's skills to the advancement of our knowledge, to the betterment of us and ideally the planet we inhabit. So more and more individuals desire to pursue academic or scientific career. There is only so much funding in science, and therefore scientists face tremendous competition in their endeavor. In my view, there is too much pressure and too much emphasis on extraordinary success. Sometimes something which is described can be described perhaps flippantly as shiny results. We insufficiently place emphasis on how research is done as opposed to what the outcome of their research is. And then, of course, there are many other aspects to being a researcher which ought to be equally, in equal measure, evaluated and appreciated. So there are tremendous pressures on researchers themselves within their community. At the same time, there has been an increased spotlight shone on individuals in the research community, on their conduct, on their behavior, which is, of course, right. There is no place, there should not be place for misconduct in the research community. One manifestation of scientific misconduct in scientific journals is retraction of published papers. It has to be said very clearly that retraction is not always associated with misconduct per se. And science itself, of course, progresses through self correction. That's a well known adage which members of the scientific community repeat for all the good reasons. Science looks back at its findings, at its conclusions, evaluates them continuously, builds on them, but also evaluates them in light of new facts that arise, in light of new methodologies that become available. And so revisions of position are normal part of scientific process. Some of the criticism that we see of science confounds misconduct and that revision of position. I think that's not healthy. And I would say members of the research community, like myself, but most emphatically researchers themselves, should clearly communicate that difference. One is, if you like, a normal part and parcel of research. The other is something that should be prevented.
For the peer reviewed research that you publish in Nature, with this spotlight and scrutiny, or maybe with the opportunity that AI now gives you in a positive way, are there new or different steps that you're taking in terms of evaluating that research before it goes to print?
And the output of research is becoming more and more complex. The questions that researchers are asking are more multidisciplinary, more complex. For that reason, scientific papers are becoming more complex. They often are based on much larger and more diverse data sets. So, of course, the peer review process, scrutiny of those submitted manuscripts is evolving, is becoming more in depth. We routinely ask authors for data sets to be shared with reviewers. This is not just data sets, but of course, code. These days, a lot of research involves generation of original code. And just as data, that code needs to be evaluated through peer review. All of that information is subsequently published so that a reader, an educated, informed reader, can scrutinize it for themselves subsequently. We, over the years, more than a decade now, have developed a number of tools, prompts, and checklists for our authors to help them communicate the methodology that they've used. Some point to the fact that there is a reproducibility crisis in research. That is a problem more pronounced in some disciplines than others. But some of the issues associated with reproducibility come from lack of transparency and lack of clarity on how things were actually done. And so that's where my editors, journals such as Nature, can help and support the research community to articulate what was done, why, to address a particular question. So this process of evaluation is definitely evolving to keep in step with research itself.
A few months ago, Nature published an editorial, How Can Scientists Make the Most of the Public's Trust in Them? My sense is this relate back to a few of the things we've already talked about on this podcast, but can you explain the argument in that editorial?
I would identify two main strands that really are worth exploring to make the most of that trust, that position of trust that scientists already enjoy. And of course, that is something absolutely to celebrate. The first one is around transparency, and indeed, that's something that we talked about. But the second one, I think, is that of collaborations and partnerships. Some of the issues that we're discussing here is around trust, undue influence that is either real or perceived on how science is done. And within the scientific community, within the scientific disciplines, there exist tools to address these issues, dissect them, expose them, and perhaps counteract them. And here, I think what remains underexplored in the research community is that collaboration between natural sciences, engineering, clinical research, and social sciences. So, social scientists, such as behavioral scientists, sociologists, can help the whole community better understand their own behavior, the general public's behavior, perceptions, and anticipation. So, I think that combination of transparency, but also collaboration is really important. If you allow me make one other comment, I think that position of trust can be harnessed even further when scientists begin to collaborate with members of the general public, with the community at large. And of course, when we're talking about clinical research, healthcare in particular, also, we're talking about everyone. Health and medical care is relevant to every single individual. We're talking about patients, we're talking about the families. Involving them in setting future questions, finding the right answers, the right solutions, can really amplify that position of trust and in turn benefit immediately from the trust that already exists there.
You talk about the collaboration between scientists and the general public. One point I'd like us to finish on is a finding from an earlier report of ours where 74% of people say for information about innovation and the truth about innovation, they trust peers and scientists equally. Can you talk about how that actually might be an opportunity for the scientific and research community?
That's a wonderful finding. I do remember reading about this earlier this year, and indeed I saw it as an opportunity. To my mind, it speaks directly to that opportunity that comes from collaboration. And it's an opportunity that scientists should take up in communicating further why they do what they do, how they do it, why it's important, so that effectively every single individual becomes a messenger for that scientist and for science. Let's not forget that each one of us on a daily basis benefits in one way or another from the fruits of research, science, technology, innovation, engineering. We don't think about it, but that's true on a daily basis. So when science comes under fire and is challenged, it's not only up to scientists to defend it. It's not just an opportunity for scientists, but actually it should be down to each one of us to stand up for science, call out any potential attacks that might compromise it, because actually we all stand to benefit from it. And we can, of course, help to drive it.
What a perfect call to arms for all of our listeners, because that's someone that anyone can be a productive force in. Magdalena, what a great conversation. Thank you for the history, the context, the practical solutions for collaboration, and for all the work you're doing at Nature. To our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.